Welcome to English Insights. Today, we'll dive into the crucial topic of climate change. From causes and impacts to innovative solutions, we'll explore insights from Wikipedia, NASA, and the United Nations. Let's boost your English skills while understanding this global challenge.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be talking about climate change today, and I've got some excerpts here from Wikipedia and the United Nations website.
Oh yeah, those are great sources for this, I think.
Yeah, should be really interesting to see what we find.
Yeah, definitely a complex topic for sure.
It really is, and it seems like every day there's a new headline about heat waves, floods, or glaciers melting. It can feel a little overwhelming.
Yeah. It definitely can be, but hopefully today we can kind of break it all down and help people understand what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. And why it matters to them personally.
Right. Well, let's start with some definitions, I think.
Okay, sounds good.
The Wikipedia article makes a distinction between climate change and global warming. People use those terms interchangeably a lot.
Right. Yeah, what's the difference?
So global warming really just focuses on the increase in the Earth's average temperature.
Okay.
But climate change is broader. It includes all those knock-on effects of that warming.
So like rising sea levels and extreme weather, all that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like, the difference between having a fever and having the flu. Mm-hmm. The fever is just a symptom, but the flu is like the whole package, right? You got aches, chills, congestion, all of that.
I like that. Yeah, that's a good analogy.
And actually, the Wikipedia article mentions how the language we use is even evolving.
Oh, yeah.
We hear global heating more often now, which maybe, kind of conveys that urgency a bit better.
Yeah, it definitely has a more, serious ring to it.
It does. And, it's interesting to look back at the Earth's history. Did you know that there's a time when temperatures were naturally warmer than they are today?
Really?
Even before humans started burning fossil fuels?
I had no idea.
Yeah. So the Wikipedia article mentions the last interglacial period about 125,000 years ago. Temperatures then were already 0.5 degree to 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than what we consider the pre-industrial baseline.
Wow. So warmer Earth isn't unprecedented.
Not at all. And get this, sea levels during that time were 5 to 10 meters higher than today.
Whoa.
That's like the height of a 3 to 5 story building.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Can you imagine the coastlines completely redrawn?
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely paints a picture of what even slight warming can do.
Right.
But okay, so if the Earth's climate has shifted naturally in the past, how do we know that what's happening now is different?
That's the million-dollar question, right? The difference is the speed of the change and the driving force behind it.
Okay.
This time it's us.
Yeah.
The evidence is very clear. The planet is warming at an unprecedented rate, and human activities are the main cause.
The Wikipedia article really dives into the evidence. They mention multiple independent data sets showing this warming trend, and they even say that the 2014 to 2023 decade was a whole 1.15 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial levels.
Yeah, those numbers are hard to ignore.
Yeah, they really are.
And just so you know, to make sure they're capturing that true signal amidst natural fluctuations, scientists use a 20-year average when they're analyzing these trends.
Okay, that makes sense.
Helps to smooth out, those year-to-year ups and downs.
Right. But this warming isn't uniform across the globe, is it?
No, it's not. You're right.
The article mentions that land warms faster than the ocean. And then there's the Arctic, which seems to be warming much faster than anywhere else.
Yeah, exactly. The Arctic has warmed nearly 4 times faster than the global average since 1979. It's like the canary in the coal mine, right?
Right.
It's giving us an early warning of what's to come.
So what's happening in the Arctic that's causing it to heat up so rapidly?
So a few things. As the ice and snow melt, the surface becomes darker and absorbs more solar radiation, which leads to further warming, creating kind of this vicious cycle.
A feedback loop.
Yeah, and there are also changes in atmospheric circulation patterns that are channeling more heat toward the poles.
So it seems like everything is connected.
There really is.
The article mentions some pretty alarming consequences of this rapid Arctic warming, like thawing permafrost, releasing even more greenhouse gases.
Right. And another big concern is the potential weakening of major ocean currents, like the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, but it plays a vital role in regulating global climate, so disrupting it could have far-reaching consequences for weather patterns and ecosystems.
So the warming in the Arctic isn't just an isolated problem. It can have ripple effects across the planet.
Exactly.
That's pretty unsettling.
Yeah, it is. And this brings us to kind of the heart of the issue. How do scientists actually know that humans are the main drivers of this warming?
Right. It's not like we can run a giant experiment on the whole planet and see what would happen without human influence.
We can't, but scientists have developed other ways to identify, the human fingerprint on climate change. They have examined natural factors that can influence climate, like solar activity, volcanic eruptions, variations in the Earth's orbit.
And what did they find?
That those natural factors alone can't explain the warming trend that we're seeing.
Okay.
The magnitude and the pace of the warming are unprecedented in human history.
The Wikipedia article even talks about how scientists have identified specific fingerprints that distinguish human-caused warming from natural fluctuations. Can you give us some examples of these fingerprints?
Sure, one compelling piece of evidence is the way our atmosphere is warming. We see significant warming in the lower atmosphere where greenhouse gases trap heat, but the upper atmosphere has actually cooled.
Interesting.
This pattern aligns perfectly with the increase in greenhouse gases from human activities, but it's inconsistent with natural causes.
Okay, so let's talk about those greenhouse gases. The Wikipedia article explains the basics of the greenhouse effect. It seems pretty simple. Certain gases in the atmosphere act like a blanket, trapping heat from the sun and warming the planet.
Yeah, it is a simple concept, but the consequences are far-reaching.
Right.
The problem is we've been thickening that blanket by burning fossil fuels and releasing massive amounts of CO2, methane, other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
And the article puts those emissions into perspective with a pretty mind-boggling statistic. In 2019 alone, global human-caused greenhouse gas emissions were equivalent to 59 billion tons of CO2.
It's hard to even fathom that number. Imagine a line of dump trucks, each one filled with CO2 stretching around the Earth 13 times. That's what we're releasing into the atmosphere every year.
That's a lot of CO2.
It is, and the article breaks down the sources showing that fossil fuels are the biggest culprit, accounting for a whopping 75% of those emissions.
Okay, so it really highlights the need to transition away from fossil fuels and embrace those cleaner sources of energy if we're going to curb these emissions.
Absolutely.
But it's not just CO2 that's driving climate change, is it? The article mentions other factors like aerosols and clouds.
Right, those tiny particles in the atmosphere can have both warming and cooling effects.
Oh, wow.
Which adds another layer of complexity to the whole climate system.
Yeah, I remember reading about something called global dimming, where certain aerosols actually reflect sunlight away from the Earth and have a cooling effect.
Exactly. Sulfate aerosols from burning fossil fuels are a good example.
Okay.
The irony is that by polluting our air, we've been unintentionally masking some of the warming from greenhouse gases.
So it's like we've had our foot on the accelerator and the brake at the same time.
Another good analogy, yeah. As we implement pollution controls to improve air quality, we're essentially taking our foot off the brake, and that full warming effect of those greenhouse gases becomes more and more apparent.
That's not a good sign.
No, it's not.
And the article also mentions black carbon, which is essentially soot from combustion, and when it settles on snow and ice, it makes them darker, leading to more sunlight absorption and faster melting.
Right. It's another example of how seemingly small changes can have a significant impact on the whole climate system.
Yeah, and it really highlights how interconnected everything is.
It really is.
Okay, so we've covered the basic science, the evidence for warming, and the role of human activity. But what I'm really curious about is what this all means for us, for the planet. You know, what are the real-world impacts of this changing climate?
Well, that's where things get really interesting and perhaps a little bit concerning. We can dive into those impacts and what we can do about them in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, come good.
Welcome back to our deep dive into climate change.
Yeah, we've laid the groundwork, understanding the science behind our warming planet. Now I think it's time to explore the consequences. What are the real-world impacts of this changing climate?
Well, that's where things get a little more tangible and, unfortunately, a bit alarming. The Wikipedia article paints a rather stark picture. It's not just about numbers and graphs. It's about real changes happening right now.
Right, like those extreme heat waves we've been seeing more and more frequently. I remember last summer there were cities all over the world breaking temperature records, people struggling to stay cool, and the power grids were under immense strain.
Exactly. And those heat waves are only going to become more frequent and intense as the planet continues to warm. The article highlights how climate change acts as a threat multiplier. It exacerbates existing social and economic inequalities.
That makes sense. The people who are already the most vulnerable are often hit the hardest by these extreme events. They might not have access to air conditioning, reliable health care, or the resources to relocate.
Precisely. And it's not just heat waves. The article lists a whole cascade of impacts. We're seeing changes in rainfall patterns, leading to more intense droughts in some regions and floods in others.
There have been some devastating floods in recent years, displacing millions of people and causing billions of dollars in damage. And then there are the hurricanes and typhoons, which seem to be getting stronger and more destructive.
Right. Warmer ocean temperatures provide more energy for these storms, fueling their intensity. And as sea levels rise, storm surges can penetrate further inland, causing even more widespread damage.
The article mentions rising sea levels as a major concern, and it's something that really hits home for coastal communities. We're already seeing some low-lying islands and coastal areas being swallowed by the rising tides.
It's a slow-motion crisis, but its impact is undeniable. And it's not just about the loss of land. Saltwater intrusion can contaminate freshwater sources, threatening agriculture and drinking water supplies.
The consequences are far-reaching, affecting everything from ecosystems to human health and livelihoods. It's clear that we can't ignore this problem, so what can we do about it?
The good news is that it's not too late to act. The articles discuss two main approaches: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is all about reducing greenhouse gas emissions to slow down the rate of warming, while adaptation focuses on adjusting to the changes that are already happening.
So it's a two-pronged approach, tackling the root cause of the problem while also learning to live with the consequences.
Exactly. Let's start with mitigation. What comes to mind when you think about ways to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, the most obvious solution is to shift away from fossil fuels and embrace cleaner energy sources like solar, wind, and hydro.
You got it. The articles highlight the enormous potential of renewable energy to power our world without the carbon footprint of fossil fuels. They suggest that with the right policies and investments, we could see a dramatic increase in the use of renewables.
The article even lays out a pretty ambitious scenario. To achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, renewable energy would need to become the dominant source of electricity generation, rising to 85% or more in some regions.
It's a bold goal, but not impossible. Think about how quickly solar and wind energy have grown in recent years. Imagine what we could achieve with a concerted global effort.
But the article also acknowledges that there are challenges to overcome. One issue I've always wondered about is the intermittency of renewable energy sources. The sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. How do we ensure a reliable energy supply when we're relying on these variable sources?
That's a great question. And it's something researchers and engineers are actively working on. The article mentions expanding battery storage capacity as a crucial piece of the puzzle. Imagine giant batteries that can soak up excess solar energy during the day and release it at night or when the wind isn't blowing.
That's a fascinating solution. It seems like battery technology is advancing rapidly, so maybe that's a viable option.
It's certainly a key part of the transition to a clean energy future. The article also mentions other strategies like long-distance transmission lines, which would allow us to share energy across regions. So if it's not sunny in one area, we could import solar power from somewhere else where it is sunny.
It's like creating a giant interconnected energy network, spreading out the risk of intermittency.
Exactly. It's about diversifying our energy portfolio and creating a more resilient energy system. But it's not just about electricity. We need to decarbonize transportation, heating, and other sectors as well.
Right. That means phasing out gas-guzzling cars and transitioning to electric vehicles, improving public transit, making our buildings more energy efficient, and even exploring low-carbon fuels for shipping and aviation.
You've hit on all the key points. It's a whole system transformation that requires innovation, investment, and a shift in our mindset.
The article also highlights the importance of energy conservation. It seems like the simplest solution is often overlooked.
You're right. Reducing our energy demand is essential. If we need less energy, we have more flexibility in how we generate it. It's the low-hanging fruit of climate action.
So things like switching to LED light bulbs, using public transportation, and making our homes more energy efficient can all make a difference.
Absolutely. Every little bit helps. And the article points out that achieving our climate goals will require significant investments in energy efficiency, comparable to the level of investment in renewable energy.
It makes sense, but investing in clean energy and energy efficiency seems expensive. What about the economic costs?
That's a common concern. But the article highlights that inaction is far more costly in the long run. The economic impacts of climate change are already being felt worldwide. We're seeing more extreme weather events, crop failures, and disruptions to supply chains, all of which have significant economic costs.
So it's a matter of paying now or paying later. But the later cost is likely to be much higher.
Exactly. And it's not just about the financial cost, it's about the human costs as well. Climate change threatens lives, livelihoods, and well-being. It exacerbates poverty, inequality, and social unrest.
That brings us back to the issue of climate justice. The people who have contributed the least to climate change are often the ones who suffer the most from its consequences.
It's a critical point. The transition to a clean energy future must be just and equitable. It needs to prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable communities and ensure that everyone benefits from the transition.
Okay, so we've talked about clean energy, energy efficiency, and the economic and ethical considerations. But what about those hard-to-decarbonize sectors like agriculture and heavy industry? What can we do about those emissions?
That's where things get a bit more challenging. The article suggests a combination of strategies for agriculture, including shifting towards more plant-based diets, improving agricultural practices to reduce emissions, and protecting and restoring forests.
So eating less meat and more vegetables can actually have a positive impact on the climate.
Absolutely. Livestock, especially cattle, produce significant amounts of methane, a potent greenhouse gas. By reducing our meat consumption, we can help lower those emissions.
That's something I can definitely get behind. What about industry? What can be done to reduce emissions from sectors like steel and cement production?
The article mentions that research into alternative chemistries and production processes is key to reducing CO2 emissions from these sectors. It also talks about carbon capture and storage, a technology that can capture CO2 emissions from industrial sources and store them underground.
I've heard about carbon capture, but it seems like a complex and expensive technology.
It is, and there are still challenges in terms of cost and scalability, but it's a potential tool in our mitigation toolkit, especially for those hard-to-decarbonize sectors.
And then there's carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, which involves actively removing CO2 from the atmosphere.
Right. The article discusses several CDR approaches, including reforestation, afforestation, and enhancing natural carbon sinks in soils and oceans.
So planting trees, restoring degraded lands, and promoting sustainable farming practices can all contribute to removing CO2 from the atmosphere.
Exactly. But the article also cautions that relying too heavily on CDR technologies carries risks. It's essential to pursue these approaches in conjunction with aggressive emission reductions.
It's like trying to bail out a sinking boat while still pouring water into it.
A good analogy. We need to tackle the problem at both ends, reducing emissions and removing CO2 that's already in the atmosphere.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground on mitigation. But what about adaptation? What are some strategies for adapting to the changes that are already happening and those that are projected to occur in the future?
The articles discuss a wide range of adaptation strategies, from developing early warning systems for extreme weather events to building seawalls to protect coastal communities from rising sea levels.
So it's about preparing for the inevitable impacts of climate change and finding ways to minimize the damage.
Exactly. The articles also talk about implementing water conservation measures, developing drought-resistant crops, and strengthening healthcare systems to cope with heat-related illnesses and the spread of infectious diseases.
It's a multifaceted approach that requires a lot of planning, investment, and collaboration.
You're absolutely right. And the UN website emphasizes that adaptation needs to be prioritized for the most vulnerable people and communities. They are often the ones least equipped to cope with the impacts of climate change, yet they are often hit the hardest.
That's an important point about climate justice. We need to make sure that adaptation efforts are equitable and reach those who need them most. But can adaptation really solve the problem? What if the impacts of climate change become so severe that we can't adapt?
That's a crucial question, and it brings us to the heart of the challenge. While adaptation is essential, it has its limits. Some impacts, like the potential collapse of major ice sheets or the disruption of ocean currents, could have catastrophic consequences that are beyond our ability to adapt to fully.
So it's a race against time. We need to act now to mitigate climate change and prevent the worst-case scenarios from unfolding.
You've got it. Adaptation can buy us time and reduce the impacts, but it's not a substitute for addressing the root cause of the problem.
In this second part of our deep dive, we've explored the multifaceted challenges of climate change, its impact on our world, and the potential solutions to mitigate and adapt. We've covered the science, the technology, the economics, and the ethical considerations. But what does it all mean in the grand scheme of things? What's at stake if we fail to act? That's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. Welcome back. It feels like we've covered so much already in this deep dive. We've gone from understanding the science behind climate change to exploring its real-world impacts and even the solutions that are on the table.
We have, but, we've been focusing a lot on what we can do.
Right.
And I think now it's time to kind of grapple with the bigger picture. What happens if we don't act decisively? What are the potential consequences of inaction?
Yeah, that's a question that keeps me up at night sometimes. The Wikipedia article doesn't sugarcoat things. It talks about the potential for triggering these irreversible changes in the climate system, what they call tipping points.
Yeah, tipping points, those thresholds beyond which we can expect these dramatic and often unpredictable shifts in the Earth's systems.
It makes me think of that scene in a movie where someone steps on a seemingly stable surface only to have the whole thing collapse beneath their feet.
That's a good analogy. The article specifically mentions the collapse of major ice sheets, which could lead to catastrophic sea level rise and the disruption of ocean currents, which could throw global weather patterns into chaos.
Yeah, it's scary to think about those cascading effects where one change triggers another, and then another leading to this domino effect that's difficult to control.
Exactly. The article also talks about feedback loops, where warming triggers further warming, for example, as permafrost thaws. It releases methane, a potent greenhouse gas, which then contributes to more warming, and the cycle just continues.
It feels like we're playing with fire and we're getting dangerously close to those tipping points. What does the UN website say about the human cost of inaction?
The UN website really brings the humanitarian crisis into focus. It talks about mass displacement as rising sea levels force people from their homes, and extreme weather events create climate refugees.
We're already seeing this happening in some parts of the world where people are being forced to leave their ancestral lands due to rising seas or desertification. It's a tragedy unfolding in real time.
It is, and the UN warns that the scale of displacement could be unprecedented as the impacts of climate change intensify. They also highlight the potential for food and water scarcity as agricultural yields decline and water resources become more unpredictable.
That's a frightening thought. Climate change could lead to mass migrations, conflicts over resources, social unrest. It's a recipe for instability and suffering on a global scale.
It's a stark reminder that climate change is not just an environmental issue. It's a humanitarian crisis with profound social, economic, and geopolitical consequences.
It feels like we're talking about a dystopian future out of a science fiction novel, but this is the reality we're facing if we don't change course.
You're right. The future is not predetermined. The choices we make today will determine the world we leave for future generations.
And that brings us to the ethical dimensions of climate change, which the articles also touch on. It's not just about the practical challenges, it's about our moral responsibility to act.
The articles raise questions of intergenerational justice. Do we have a moral obligation to act now to protect future generations from the worst impacts of climate change? I think that's a question we each have to grapple with.
It's a heavy responsibility, but it also feels empowering. We have agency, we have a choice. And it's not just about future generations. The articles also highlight the issue of climate justice, recognizing that the impacts of climate change disproportionately affect those who have contributed the least to the problem, the poor, the marginalized in communities in developing countries.
It's an ethical imperative to address those inequalities and ensure that the transition to a sustainable future is just and equitable for everyone.
In addition to the ethical considerations, the articles also acknowledge the psychological impacts of climate change. It's not just our physical world that's being affected. It's our mental and emotional well-being as well.
It's understandable that people are feeling a range of emotions: anxiety, grief, fear, anger, even despair. Climate change is a daunting challenge, and the scale of the problem can feel overwhelming.
Yeah, I've definitely felt those emotions myself. Sometimes it feels like the problem's just too big and there's nothing I can do to make a difference.
I think it's important to acknowledge those feelings. They're valid, but we can't allow ourselves to succumb to despair. The articles also emphasize the importance of hope, resilience, and collective action.
Right. Despair can be paralyzing, but hope can be motivating. It's about finding that balance between acknowledging the seriousness of the situation and maintaining a sense of agency and optimism.
Exactly. And it's about remembering that we're not alone in this. There's a global movement of people working towards a sustainable future. We can find strength and inspiration in each other's efforts.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? We've delved deep into the complexities of climate change, exploring its causes, consequences, and potential solutions. It's clear that this is the defining challenge of our time.
It is, but I believe it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to reimagine our relationship with the planet, to create a more just and equitable world, and to build a future where people and nature can thrive together.
So where do we go from here? What are the key takeaways from our climate change deep dive?
First and foremost, climate change is real. It's human-caused, and it's happening now. The science is clear, and the impacts are already being felt around the world.
Second, climate change is not just an environmental issue. It's a social, economic, and ethical challenge that affects us all. It's a threat to our health, our livelihoods, our security, and our very way of life.
Third, we have the solutions to address climate change. We can transition to clean energy, reduce our energy demand, adopt sustainable practices, and invest in adaptation and resilience. But those solutions require bold action, collective effort, and a fundamental shift in our values and priorities.
Fourth, addressing climate change is not just about technology and policy. It's about individual choices and collective action. Each of us has a role to play, from reducing our own carbon footprint to advocating for change at all levels of society.
And finally, climate change is a defining challenge of our time, but it's not insurmountable. We have the knowledge, the resources, and the ingenuity to create a sustainable future, but we need to act now with urgency and determination.
This deep dive has provided a glimpse into the complexities of climate change, but it's just the beginning of the conversation.
We encourage you to delve deeper into the sources we've explored to stay informed, to engage in dialogue, and to find ways to make a difference in your own community.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. Remember, our choices matter, our actions have consequences, and together we can create a future where both people and the planet thrive.
Thank you for joining English Insights. We hope you've gained valuable knowledge about climate change while improving your English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful content. See you next time.